On this episode, Once Upon a Real Life with Bel, a mighty warship to dazzle a king, the year 1628. And we're going to Stockholm, Sweden. The Vasa, a formidable warship, sets sail on its maiden voyage, sensational display to sink within minutes in Stockholm's harbour. Centuries, the Vasa was lost to history. In 1961, she rose again, almost perfectly preserved. Incredible drama, ambition, disaster, one of the greatest recoveries in history.
The person who wanted Vasa built was the King of Sweden, Gustav Adolf, who was reforming the military of Sweden because he felt that Sweden could punch above its weight and could compete with the larger countries of Europe to the south. And compete against any of the other navies that might come into the Baltic. So in the 1620s, he started ordering new ships. Sweden's enemies, to the east, you had Russia. In the south, you had Poland, Lithuania, which was ruled by Gustav's first cousin, who claimed to be the king of Sweden. There was a dynastic squabble there. You also had Germany and the German Empire to the south. To the west, you had Denmark and Norway. So all of those were potential enemies. In fact, Sweden fought wars against all of them in the course of the 17th century. Vasa embodies the king's vision of what naval warfare was going to be. The typical Swedish warship had about 20 and 30 guns, but the king's vision of the future was naval warfare would be artillery duels between these heavily armed gun platforms. He signed a contract for the construction of an entirely new type with 2 full decks of guns and much heavier guns, 24-pounders instead of 12-pounders. He was a keen artillerist himself.
This is the Vasa.
That's the first of that new class of ships, what we call the Vasa class.
We have a commission. We have a shipbuilder. What happens?
It took about a year and a half to build the ship. The shipbuilder might have thought that original specification was not right. It needed not to be wider, it needed to be deeper. The shipwright was from the Netherlands. He preferred shallow draft hulls, which is fine if you're only carrying 1 deck of guns. But if you've got sight that you're carrying 2 decks of guns, that kind of shallow hull just doesn't work. The ship is too tall for the amount of ship that's in the water. Combined with the fact that the decks are too tall, they're too heavily built.
That shipbuilder passed away and a new builder came in.
But yeah, Henrik died. The designer died about the time that the ship was being launched. Vasa was unstable.
I heard a story that when they were testing Vasa, the crewmen would run from one side to the other.
It's called sallying the ship, a stability test, but it was really a demonstration. It's reported in the inquest after the ship sank that the captain dragged the admiral in charge of procurement down to the ship and had him watch while he ordered 30 sailors to run back and forth across the upper deck to make the ship roll, to show the admiral that the ship wasn't safe. He was trying to stop the ship from being sent to sea.
It was a big fanfare the day of the ship sailing.
Yes, and then also lots of people in small boats. There's more than 780 sculptural elements on the ship. We tend to think of that now as decoration, but that's not how somebody thought about it in the 17th century. It's part of the ship's function. Every warship has 2 equally important functions: a physical function to be a gun platform, but also a metaphysical warship, a symbolic vessel that represents the owner's ambition, policy, self-image. You appear in other people's ports, you appear off your own coast to remind your enemies that not to mess with you. And so there's this program of sculptures all over the ship, mostly at the bow and the stern. The sides you had to keep relatively clear because the cannon were there, and you also had rigging that would sweep the sides. And it uses a language of symbols that people were used to seeing in churches and on palaces.
It's so unique. So the ship is in the dock. There's concerns. Set sail anyway. What happens?
On the 10th of August, 1628, we get the ship to sea. On a Sunday afternoon at about 4 o'clock, it cast off from the palace until it got to the southern end of the harbor. The captain was trying to be as absolutely careful as he could. Technically, it's 1,250 meters, a little more than a kilometer. There's a big blower, and that fills the sails, heeled the ship over to port enough that the lower gun ports were in the water. Water started to run in through the gun ports. The problem with Vasa is it's balanced with water running in through the gun ports until it filled the deck and ran down the hatches into the hold and filled the ship, and it sank. We think that might have taken about 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Once the ship sank, they simply swam to shore. If you couldn't swim, Even once the ship came to rest on you could hold on to the rigging until a boat picked you up. Or at least one record of lots of boats following the ship plucked people out of the water.
Was there some blame?
There was an inquest after the loss of Vasa. They questioned all of the surviving officers. They questioned the builders to evaluate the evidence, to try to figure out what happened, but also whose fault it was. They had questioned on whether the guns were secured. One of the things that could sink a ship is if the guns got loose and rolled all to one side of the ship. That's enough weight to heel it over. It was testified by the master of artillery that all the guns were secured. And we can see from the archaeology that he was telling the truth. There was also questions about, were the crew drunk? My favorite answer in the inquest was from the ship's boatswain, Per Bertilsson, who was asked, were you drunk? And he said, the only thing I had to drink was the wine at communion. And it's clear that everybody understood that the problem with Vasa was that it was a bad design. That is the fundamental problem with the ship. There was an English engineer who came to the Royal Council and claimed that he could raise the ship. So 2 days after it sank, he succeeded in cranking it up right again, but he couldn't get it loose from the bottom. He couldn't break it free of the mud that it sunk into, and he couldn't get it to the surface. And there were attempts all through the piece to try to recover the ship. In fact, when the ship was found, there were over 50 anchors stuck in it that were the remains of all of these attempts to raise the ship in the 1630s. About 35 years after the ship sank, a pair of entrepreneurs took a diving bell to the ship, and they recovered almost all of the ship's cannon, which they were allowed to keep according to their contract.
Then you've got another 300 years that goes by. Are we talking about it, or is it lost to history?
It wasn't completely forgotten. There's a cautionary tale for young officers, don't do this. The wreck is marked on harbor charts for the 19th century, used the site as a training place until World War I for training helmet divers. There was never knowledge about the wreck, never completely disappeared. By the summer of 1956, relocated it. Not surprisingly, exactly where the harbor charts of the 1850s says it is. We have about 98% of the original timber of the ship. So it is more or less a complete ship from 400 years ago. He persuaded the National Maritime Museum to provide museum expertise, convinced the largest private towing and salvage company in Scandinavia, Broströms, to provide their expertise for the actual raising, and all of them to do it for free. So all of these people, out of their normal operating budgets, put together their resources to recover the ship. The Navy provided the divers, Broströms provided the salvage vessels at the surface, Heritage Board provided conservators, and the Maritime Museum provided curators. They spent 2 years diving work to get the ship ready to move it from it where it sank to a shallower spot in the harbor where they could repair it underwater. April of 1961, when it was raised to the surface, they could just pump the water out of it and it floated again. 133 years on the bottom of the harbor.
Stuck in mud, they're going to dig away what they can that's solidified. There'd be, mud inside the ship as well?
There was about 1,000 tons of mud and artifacts inside the ship. The way they decided to raise it was the same method they had tried immediately after it sank. You park 2 floating vessels on the surface above it, connect those vessels to the sunken vessel by cables, pump the vessels on the surface full of water as low as you can go without sinking them, tighten all the cables, and then pump the water back out of those 2 at the surface. They rise in the water and they'll lift the sunken ship. That's exactly what they did between 1956 and 1959, was they, in a series of 18 lifts, moved the ship from where it had sunk, where the water was 32 meters deep, to water about half that deep. And then divers spent another year and a half building in the broken parts of the stern and the bow, putting covers over all the gun ports, plugs in all the empty bolt holes. When it was pulled to the surface at the end, it was watertight enough that you could float it into a dry dock. Yeah,
When it was lifted?
I think about 10,000 people watched.
Wow.
The ship brought to the surface. They dug 6 tunnels completely under the hull and passed cables completely around the ship. And digging the tunnels helped break the suction between the bottom of the ship and the clay of the harbor bottom. Right. Yeah. Stockholm Harbor is 3 degrees year-round on the bottom and mostly fresh water. And there's no oxygen at the bottom of Stockholm Harbor. There's not a lot of stuff that lives that will destroy the wood. The Baltic generally has very good conditions for preservation. Ships that sink in the Baltic tend to stay intact unless people destroy them.
This is a ginormous museum, Vasa. I would say the ship itself would be 3 times the size of my home.
We have a staff of about 12 people who do nothing except look after the ship and the collections. Also 40,000 objects found in and around the ship that are part of the collection as well. There was a long process of preserving the ship after it was recovered.
What year was the museum opened?
The museum that we're in now was opened 1990, about 600 meters, 500 meters from where it sank, of our museum. Being asked to be the head of research at Vasa is like being picked for the all-star team. There's not really a better job in my field than this. You're going to ask, is there a Vasa ghost or a Vasa curse?
So that's my interest.
Well, there were people who died there, and we have the remains of them, and I've handled those people quite a lot in the course of studying them. But I do like to joke that there is a Vasa curse. Years ago, when we started a project to look at the human remains, to get a sense of who they were, to try to analyze DNA from archaeological remains to see if they could extract DNA from our skeletons. One of the best places for DNA to be preserved is in your teeth. To generate a baseline, we would extract one tooth, a molar, from each skull of the 10 people to see if we could get DNA out of them. I was the director of research, and I made the decision that it was worthwhile to sacrifice these teeth. And then my wife, who is the head of conservation, said that she would take responsibility for extracting a tooth without damaging any of the surrounding bone. So we sent these teeth off, and within a month of us making the decision to do that.
So for our listeners,
I joke
Fred
that that's the Vasa
has
curse.
lost a molar, and your wife as well.
Yep. 10 years later, DNA techniques had improved. The DNA specialist said they wanted to take examples by sawing through the leg bones. And I said, I'm out. I'll lose a tooth. I'm not losing a leg.